watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Hi, welcome to Shalom TV. I am Mordechai Becher, and this is Dimensions of the Daf, in which we look at sections of the Mishnah and the Talmud, rabbinic wisdom from thousands of years ago, and investigate a little piece each week, each episode. You don't have to see the previous ones because each one stands by itself, and hopefully you should be able to understand this even if you don't have much of a background in Hebrew, Aramaic, Mishnah, or Talmud. It's designed for pretty much anyone. And also thanks for feedback that we got recently, a couple of emails and people I saw. Anyway, this week's subject is many students standing. And this is a reference to a Mishnah, section of the Mishnah, in a famous section of the Mishnah, which is known as Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot literally means the chapters of the fathers. It is usually translated as ethics of the fathers because it's a section of the Mishnah that does not deal with law, and does not deal with commandments, explicit commandments, festivals and stuff like that. It deals generally with personality development, ethics, character traits, etc. Things that are not specific commandments of the Torah, but things which are important, equally as important nonetheless. So I'm going to deal with the very first Mishnah in Ethics of the Fathers. I'm not going to deal with the whole Mishnah. It's a there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of commentary written just on this one Mishnah because it contains within it a tremendous amount of history and philosophy. But I want to deal just with the last part of the Mishnah. It says this: Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Mount Sinai, which is where the revelation, God reveals the Torah to the entire Jewish people, transmits it, the written Torah, 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. Umasara Yeshua, Moses gave it over to Joshua. Joshua, of course, was his student par excellence. He was the next leader in the line of the leaders of the Jewish people. Of course, Moses transmitted it to the entire Jewish people, but the ruler, the leader of the Jewish people, the one responsible for transmission of the Torah, that was Joshua, his disciple. The Yeshua L'Zakanim, Joshua transmitted it to the elders. The elders were people who were the great leaders of the Jewish people who lived at the same time as Joshua and lived for about 400 years after Joshua until the time of the first kings of Israel. First kings of Israel, we're talking about 2,500, about 2,900 years ago or so. King Saul, King David, King Solomon. And then the elders gave it over to the prophets who lived at this time. Samuel, you've heard of Shmuel the prophet, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., all extending all the way through the times of the kings of Israel. And the Zakanim, the elders gave it over to the prophets. The prophets gave it over to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly refers to Knesset, means an assembly, and actually the term for the Israeli parliament today, they derived it from this group of people. Actually, the number of members in the Knesset, 120, which is based on the model of the men of the Great Assembly. This was a group of great rabbis who were the supreme court of the Jewish people, and almost like the parliament as well, at the beginning of the Second Temple era. Just to give you a line historically, so the Jews leave Egypt approximately 3,300 years ago. 400 years after they get out of Egypt, we've got the first kings of Israel, King Saul, King David. King Solomon builds the first temple that lasts for 400 years. So that means that's 800 years after the Jews come out of Egypt. And approximately then, the Babylonian Empire destroys, under Nebuchadnezzar, destroys the first temple, exiles the Jews to Babylon, modern-day Iraq and Iran. The Jews are in exile there. 70 years after the exile, Cyrus, King Cyrus of Persia, allows the Jews to return to the land of Israel. And under the great sages or prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews returned to the land of Israel. Not all the Jews, most of them didn't, but a few 100,000 Jews returned to the land of Israel and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and re-establish a Jewish kingdom, monarchy, in the land of Israel that had been interrupted by 70-year exile. So we have approximately 800 years of the Jews in Israel, 400 of those years with the temple, 400 years before the temple. Then we have 70 years of Babylon. People probably familiar with the section of Psalms, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, very famous. And that's where we made the oath, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning. If I do not exalt you over my greatest joy, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So that's all there. And then the Jews come back to Israel and we rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So we're not talking approximately 2,400 years ago. So about 2,400 years ago is what we call the Second Commonwealth, meaning the Jews in Israel, this is the second time, interrupted by exile, but now the Second Commonwealth and the Second Temple. Beginning of the Second Commonwealth, Second Temple era, is the time where the men of the Great Assembly were the leaders of the Jewish people. These 120 rabbis, and I should point out, amongst them were a number of the later prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I hate English transliterations. I just like the Hebrew. It's just the more authentic pronunciation. So anyway, so Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, a number of the later prophets were amongst this group of 120 elders. And they received the Torah from the prophets, who received it from the elders, who received it from Joshua, who received it from Moses, who received it from God. So that's the line of transmission. And it says this. If you're looking on in the Mishnah, it says, Haim amru shlosha dvarim. They said three things. I should point out, obviously, the 120 rabbis, amongst them a number of prophets, didn't only say three things. They said thousands of things. But these are three things that are chosen, three chosen words from the chosen people. But basically, they're selected because they have some type of relevance to that time and place, or because they are maybe the most important messages for us. Either way, they said three things. Hevu metunim bedin. Be deliberate in judgment. They've translated here, be patient in judgment. Be slow to come to judgment. Now, this is something directed towards a rabbi or a judge, someone who's sitting in a situation of judgment. Never come to a hasty judgment. Always do it slowly. Think about things. The judgment's got to be holistic. Take into account every single factor that you can. Slow to come to judgment. Ha'amidu talmidim harbe. Teach many students. Or as the Sonsino translation, which I've copied here, is rear many disciples. Va'asu siyag l'Torah, and make a fence around the Torah, which I've forgotten to capitalize, I'm sorry. Right? So be patient in judgment, slow to come to judgment, set yourself up many students, and make a fence around the Torah. Some say that these rabbis, because they knew they were at the end of the era of prophecy, we don't have prophets anymore. We haven't had prophets for 2,000, no, prophets with a PH, by the way, right? So these are, for approximately 2,500 years was the end of the era of prophecy. These rabbis knew that we were lacking now the clarity that we had of God speaking to a person. That's an unbelievable level of clarity. We don't have that anymore. So that means we're left to our own devices to be able to use our intellect to try to figure out what it is that God wants from us. To look into the Torah, look into the prophets and the writings, the Talmud, figure out what is it God wants. So we have to use our intellect. So they give us three ideas. Number one, be very slow. Use your dwell on things. That's something we're not used to nowadays. You know, texting and emails and our communication is so instantaneous that we no longer dwell over things. I remember when I was a student in rabbinical school in Israel in 1978. So we didn't have emails, and I used to write to my parents. I used to write them a letter once a week on an aerogram. You know, you'd fold it up and like paste down the things and send it in the mail. People may be familiar with this idea, and you send it in the mail. But you see, when you write a letter, you have to sit there and think about it. You dwell on it. So Matunim Bedin, the first idea is to dwell on what you are judging, what you are saying, to apply your intellect to it. That's number one advice. Even though we don't have the prophecy, we don't have clarity, but we do have our intellect. And if we apply our intellect, we can get very, very far. The second piece of advice is make sure you have many students. Because you see, when you have to explain something to someone, you will force yourself to understand it better. I know that when I study something for my own personal study, I don't think I go into it and understand it as well as if I know that I'm going to have to explain this to someone else. When I need to explain it to someone else, I have greater clarity. I go into it with greater depth. And even more so, when you have students who are not like you, who are out there and I don't see you, but when I'm teaching a class and I've got people right here, then I'm also challenged by their questions and their comments. And that means I've got to exert myself further. And it may be that they will point out a mistake. I actually made mistakes. I think I made one in 82. No, it was 83. Whatever. But anyway, but when you make a mistake, you've got these people, there's critics there. So yes, I lack the clarity of the prophets, but I apply my intellect, and if I have many students, then hopefully they'll pick up the mistakes, they'll criticize, they will ask questions, and I'll become more clear and greater clarity, greater understanding, greater perception. And finally, even if I've taken all these precautions, asur siyag, try to make a fence around the Torah, meaning try to make laws that will create a fence so that I don't stumble in the actual biblical prohibitions. In other words, try to make laws that will prevent me from, even if I was wrong, hopefully I create a buffer zone so I don't stumble on the original biblical prohibition. So, and obviously you'll see these are three categories. One is thought, be slow to come to judgment. The other is speech, set up many students. And the third is action, which is make a fence around the Torah. So thought, speech, and action each are involved here. But I would have liked to focus on the second statement, which is this. Ha'amidu talmidim harbe. Make yourself or teach many students. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what do we mean by many? You could teach students, but why? What do you mean by many students? So if you look at the next slide, I have a piece of the Talmud here from Brachot, Tractate Brachot 27b, 28a. It's a fascinating piece of Gemara, and it talks about a situation where you had the head of the yeshiva. A yeshiva is an academy in which we study Talmud. And it's probably one of the oldest lasting types of academies that there exists. In fact, the academies of Babylon were started by Ezra and Nehemiah. So if you think about it, they were started by the people who were exiled from Israel at the destruction of the first temple, which is approximately 2,500 years ago. And they lasted for over 1,000 years approximately, these Babylonian academies. So anyway, the head of the academy, the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, his name was Rabban Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel had an argument with another rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yehoshua. So Rabbi Gamliel, head of the academy, has an argument with Rabbi Yeshua, and he actually apparently treated Rabbi Yeshua with a certain amount of disrespect. He had Rabbi Yeshua standing, this student was standing up while Rabbi Gamliel was teaching. So there was a lot of murmuring. I'll just read it to you. It says this. Rabbi Gamliel was standing up, was sitting and expounding and teaching. Rabbi Yeshua remained standing. So all the students started mumbling. They started murmuring about this. The people began to shout, and they said to Chutzpit, the Turgaman, the interpreter, they said, stop teaching. This is wrong. How long can you cause this man to suffer? Last year, on Rosh Hashanah, he caused him suffering. In other words, last year apparently Rabbi Gamliel had criticized and in some way caused Rabbi Yeshua to suffer, not physical suffering, but there was a dispute between them and he had humiliated him some way. He also had another argument in terms of with another rabbi, and the Rosh Yeshiva, evidently he had an educational perspective, which was to be very strict, and when a student made a mistake, he had to feel the consequences of that mistake so he wouldn't do it again. I have had teachers like this. And anyway, some teachers, you ask a stupid question. There are teachers I've had who'd say, "Oh, excellent question," and they'd explain, and they'd create a fantastic question. It's not what you meant, but they'd create this amazing question as if that's what you meant to ask, and they make you feel really good, etc. I've had other rabbis who I've asked a stupid question. They basically would say, "That is a really stupid question. You know why?" And they'd give me 8 reasons why it's a stupid question. So whatever. I think I gained from both, but it was a lot more pleasant with the first type. But anyway, Rabbi Gamliel was one of these who had a very strict educational philosophy, but the students were not happy. And they said, "Look, he's caused suffering to Rabbi Yeshua today, this year, last year, the year before. It caused him all this suffering. We can't take this anymore. What we're going to do is depose him." So there was a coup. You got a rebellion in the yeshiva, student rebellion, and they decide to replace Rabbi Gamliel, the Rosh Yeshiva, with someone else. So they said, "Look, we can't have Rabbi Yeshua as the Rosh Yeshiva because he is the guy that this incident happened with. So it would not be right. He is type of the involved in the incident. It's not right. Should we have Rabbi Akiva, who is the next most famous sage?" They said, "Not really, because Rabbi Akiva doesn't have the merit of his forefathers. Rabbi Akiva was a convert to Judaism, and they felt for him to come up against Rabbi Gamliel when he doesn't have the merit of his ancestry would be a little dangerous for him. So if we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, let's have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because Elazar ben Azariah is wise, wealthy, and also he's a 10th generation from Ezra, the scribe, Ezra the prophet. So they say he's wise, so that means if people ask him questions, he'll be able to answer the questions. He's wealthy, which means if there's any problem with the government, the Caesar, he'll be able to pay whatever fines are imposed and keep us safe with his monetary power. And he's 10th in line, 10th generation from Ezra, which means that he's got the merit of his forefathers. He has the merit of his forefathers. That means he won't be punished. So therefore they said to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the students came to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and they said, "Look, we want you to be the head of the yeshiva." So he said, "Look, I'm sorry, I've got to ask my wife." So he goes to his wife and he says, "What do you think?" And she says, "Not a bad idea, but what if they just fire you like they did to Rabbi Gamliel?" He says, "Look," he used an expression, he says, "better to use the beautiful cup one day, even if it breaks the next day. At least I'll have this opportunity to teach." So she said to him, "Yeah, but you're not old enough. Elazar, you're a young guy. You don't even have white hairs in your beard." So he said, so apparently a miracle happened and his beard turned white that day. So he wasn't 70. He looked like 70, but God gave him the benefit of giving him a white beard, so he looked older than he really was. Anyway, he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva, and immediately the first thing he does, and this is the section I wanted to deal with primarily. The first thing he does as head of the academy is he removes the shomer, the guard from the door of the yeshiva. They had a guard at the door. They had a bouncer, like at clubs, the bouncer at the door, because you see, because the previous head of the yeshiva, part of his educational philosophy was, I'm only going to teach people who are through and through, internal and externally, they are absolutely beautiful and wonderful personalities. I am not interested in teaching anyone who is not a noble personality. So he used to have someone who would make sure no one could get into the yeshiva unless they first of all had an interview with the head of the yeshiva. So that was his educational philosophy. We only teach students who have a wonderful personality traits and a good character. However, the next head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, said no. He said, "You've got to teach anyone." And he says, he removed the guard from the yeshiva, and that day, it says, benches were added to the yeshiva. Some say 300, 400 benches, some say 700 benches, but basically, right, the yeshiva became opened up to anyone who wanted could come in. If you know someone is a corrupt individual, we don't teach him. But if I don't know, we teach them. So, and it said, and now it's interesting. It says that the previous head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Gamliel, felt very bad. He felt that maybe I've prevented people from learning Torah unjustly. Maybe I should have had a different policy. So, in a dream, he had a dream that night in which God shows him some barrels filled with ashes, beautiful white casks, but they're filled with ashes, as if to say to him, "Don't worry. Look, these people that are coming in, they look nice on the outside, but inside they're crummy, they're ashes." And the Talmud says, but the truth of the matter is, that dream was just shown to him to appease him, to make him feel good. But in fact, according to Jewish law, we rule that we should let anyone in to learn Torah. I mean, obviously, if we didn't rule that way, how could I actually teach this class on Shalom TV? I don't know who's watching. No one gets a test before they watch if they have a wonderful character, if they're upright, honest person. I don't know, right? No offense to anyone, but I don't know who's watching. Right, so therefore, we actually rule in accordance with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says we don't have a guard at the door of the yeshiva. We teach anyone who comes to learn. Anyone who comes to learn. And we rule not like Rabbi Gamliel, who says you've got to be very selective in your students. According to that, if we go back to our Mishnah, right, we see when it says Ha'amidu Talmidim Harbe, make yourself many students, that's what we mean. By many students we mean don't just teach the exclusive elite few. Don't just have the Torah for those who are the most noble of character traits and the highest IQs, etc. That's not what it's about. Our obligation is to teach the words of Torah, the words of God, to absolutely anyone we can, as many people as we can. Granted, there is, and we've discussed this in a previous class, but if there is someone I know is particularly a corrupt individual, when I teach him Torah, that means it's like putting, in the words of Proverbs, putting a gold ring in the nose of a pig, right? It's really making him this corrupt individual is going to be a walking desecration of God's name. So if I know that, I cannot teach him. But if I don't know, just the average person, I'm allowed to teach. I'm obligated to teach. So the first thing we have to say is Ha'amidu Talmidim Harbe, make yourself many students, meaning many like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, as opposed to a few like Rabbi Gamliel. That is point number one. Point number two, and I have the next slide, I want to look at the language here, because in the Mishnah it does not say teach many students. It says ha'amidu. Now literally, I have to translate, ha'amidu literally means to cause to stand. The grammatical form in Hebrew, the word in Hebrew of standing the root is omed, ayin mem dalad. Omed, I am standing, means ani omed, I'm standing. Ha'amid, which is a different grammatical form, means to cause to stand. So when it says to teach the students, actually, the terminology we use is cause many students to stand. Why do we use that terminology? So I want to give you an analogous terminology, which is actually in the Torah on the slide here. In the book of Numbers, chapter 8, God said to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and say to him, when you light the lamps of the menorah, the candelabra in the temple, when you light the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light in front of the lampstand. And Aaron did so. He lighted the lamps in the front of the lampstand as the Lord commanded. Interestingly enough, the Hebrew does not use the term light the lamps. The term it uses beha'alotcha, which means when you cause them to rise. Right? Oleh means to rise. In Hebrew, when we talk about someone going to Israel, wherever you're going, whenever you go to Israel, it's called aliyah, going up. We believe Israel is the highest country spiritually. You could be going from Tibet to Israel, you're still going up, because it's the highest country in the world spiritually. So we call it Oleh. But Oleh means to go up, but Ha'alot means to cause to rise. So Rashi, the great 12th century French Torah commentary, writes the following. He says, cause the flames to arise. One must light the candles until the flames arise by themselves. So Rashi tells us that the term beha'alotcha, cause to rise, that terminology means you must cause it to rise by itself. You must hold the kindling to it as long as the flame needs it, and then once the flame rises by itself, you then remove your match or kindling from the flame. So let us now apply this to students. Cause them to stand. What it means here is this. You have to teach your students in a way that they're eventually going to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. That they will not need me anymore. Ideally, it should be what we call planned obsolescence. the teacher should want to become obsolete to the student. I would like to teach someone to the extent that that person no longer needs me. I want to teach them so much and so effectively that they can stand up on their own 2 feet, walk away and become their own person, their own scholar. The greatest success I have is when the student no longer needs me. They may still consult me, talk to me, annoy me on emails, etc., but that they can learn and teach independently, that's really what I want. That's the ideal. And every teacher should want to impart that to their students. Laha'amid, cause your student to stand so that he can actually rise by himself and stand by himself. That's the one explanation. There's a second explanation, cause to stand, is that teaching Torah should not merely be teaching facts, but I also want to teach a student, give them the tools to live in life, how to deal with people, how to be a good person, how to have a spiritual connection to God, how to fulfill the commandments. These are the type of things where it's not merely enough to teach. I've got to be an example. I've got to show them. So therefore, and cause them to stand. I've got to teach them by example. So I've got to give them all the things they need in order to survive. Giving them all the things they need in order to survive, you can't just say teach. You've got to say cause to stand. To be able to stand up means I've got to have oxygen, I've got to have water, I've got to have food. All the things you need to survive is what the teacher has to impart to the student, cause to stand. There's a third possibility also, similar to the first explanation I gave, which is laha'amid, cause to stand means they should be able to stand up to me, i.e., that the student should not just be this pliable piece of putty that I can mold their brain as I feel necessary, right, and I feel that I'd like to. Rather, I should give the student the opportunity to stand up, meaning they should be able to argue. They don't have to accept everything I say, right? On the contrary, right, later on it says in the Mishnah that they should struggle with my words. And as Reb Chaim of Volozhin, one of the great students of the Gaon of Vilna, writes, that a student should not accept the words of the teacher if they don't understand it. They should ask a question. In other words, the student should be able to stand and ask me a question. I should teach in such a way that the students feel free to ask me questions, that the students feel free to even possibly argue with respect. They have to argue with respect. Otherwise, but no, they should treat me with respect, but they can nevertheless ask and even argue and have a different understanding. That's what it means to stand on your own 2 feet. I think it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said something to the effect that the greatest tribute to the teacher is the rebellion of the student, which I'm not sure about rebellion is the word that I would choose, but I think there's some truth to it. The greatest tribute is the student has his own understanding, his own path, and his own, but which I gave him the ability to do that. That's a fantastic thing, but he has to be able to stand on his own 2 feet. So ha'amidu talmidim harbe means many students, i.e. don't be picky, not just the elite, not just the noble of character, but anyone I should teach. Harbe, many, like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as opposed to Rabbi Gamliel, number one. Number two, ha'amidu means make myself obsolete, give them the ability to learn and teach Torah themselves. Number two, provide them not just with information, but with everything they need to survive in life, everything they need to be a good person, everything they need to teach by example and to give them all the abilities they need. And number three, to give them the ability to stand up to me, the teacher, and be able to feel free to ask questions, to argue, to debate with respect, but nevertheless to have their own opinion and their own understanding. That's a little bit of an analysis of this Mishnah, which I think is very central, very important to us. And that's the idea. And what's the reason you need many students? A few things. So that the Torah is spread throughout the world by having many students, and as we said, B, for my own benefit. The more students I have, the greater the clarity I have. The more I teach, the more students ask me questions, the more depth I will have in the subject matter. Interestingly enough, we say that the Talmud says, I learnt a lot of Torah from my teachers. I learnt even more from my colleagues, and even more from my students. The most that I learn is actually from my students, because the perspective, the questions they ask, the challenge they give to me, and the way I have to stretch myself to teach them is of tremendous benefit to me, even more benefit than colleagues, even more benefit than my actual teachers. So that's a little bit of an analysis of that Mishnah. Thank you for watching Shalom TV. I am Mordechai Becher of Gateways. You can look at our website, gatewaysonline.com, and my book, Gateway to Judaism, available for purchase, probably at libraries too, but I prefer if you bought it. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and you'll tune in next time. Dimensions of the Daf, Rabbi Mordechai Becher, Shalom TV. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.